Now, part one of this lesson is on the church website, and this is back into the story of Joseph. Remember, the title is When God Ruins Your Life, and we suppose the title comes because Joseph would not have planned this life for himself if he were to make these plans. We're here in Genesis chapter 42. Joseph is already in his elevated status in Egypt, and the famine is upon them, the one that was foretold in the visions, which he told Pharaoh. It is now upon them. And as we read in chapter 42, Jacob, Joseph's father, has heard that Egypt has grain for sale. There we go. So he sends 10 brothers to Egypt to buy grain, and we know that he withholds his now favorite son, Benjamin, supposing that Joseph is dead. And he's worried about Benjamin's safety. And it's not because Benjamin is not a capable man. He's in his 30s at this point. So he's not worried about wild beasts or even what would happen to him in Egypt. He's afraid that the brothers will harm Benjamin in the manner that they did Joseph. It's implied in the text at this point, as we'll see in several places, that Jacob now has understanding that it was the brothers' fault, that Joseph in his mind is now dead. And as we come to verse 6, the brothers having gotten to Egypt, and Joseph, of course, is the one that is selling them the grain, we see that the brothers bow down to Joseph with their faces to the ground, just like the dream that Joseph had about 20 years prior to this. And the text reveals to us that Joseph remembers the dream at this point. Joseph, of course, does not reveal himself, and he treats these strangers, as it would be, it's been many years at this point, very harshly. So it's obvious that Joseph is now treating them the way that they had treated him. He's not speaking peaceably with them. He's speaking in harsh manner and throws them in prison just as they threw him in the pit. So after 3 days in prison, Joseph tells the brothers that he fears God. And he tells them that if they will listen, that they will live. But he holds back one brother as he sends the others back to their father Jacob and tells them that they must send back Benjamin if they are to receive this other brother back. And so the brothers talked among themselves, speaking in the Hebrew language, not knowing that Joseph can understand them. And in verse 21 of chapter 42, it is said, quote, "In truth, we are guilty concerning our brother, and that we saw the distress of his soul when he begged us, and we did not listen. That is why this distress has come upon us." If you remember, Joseph was in the pit, begging for his life, and his brothers were eating lunch. Now, one of the brothers did not want to do this. The oldest brother, Reuben. Reuben answered them, quote, "Did I not tell you not to sin against the boy? But you did not listen. So now there comes a reckoning for his blood." So we notice that Joseph does not take the oldest brother, Reuben, as the prisoner, and instead takes the second oldest, Simeon, as the prisoner, and sends them along the way. But we know that he has taken the money and put it back into their sacks. And so as they're going along the way and they realize this, as they've gotten to try to feed, get some feed out of the sacks to feed their donkey, they say, verse 28, "What is this that God has done to us?" And they go on home and they go back to Jacob and they tell Jacob what has happened. And Jacob says in verse 36 of chapter 42, "You have bereaved me of my children. Joseph is no more, and Simeon is no more. And now you would take Benjamin? All this has come against me. You lost Joseph, you lost Simeon, and now you want to take Benjamin." Reuben steps up and offers his life, but this guarantee to Jacob is insufficient. So they leave their other brother Simeon in Egypt, and they go about their life. That's hard to digest. But there comes a point where they once again run out of grain, and chapter 43 opens up. The family has no food. And at this point, if you looked among all the brothers that are left, the least likely, the one who is a mess of morality in chapter 38, the one whose idea was to sell Joseph, steps up and offers his life for the life of Benjamin if he is not brought back. Judah offers. And at this point, Jacob decides, I guess it's not having food, that he will allow Benjamin to be taken to Egypt and that they will bring back grain for the family. So they go back to Egypt this time with double the money. They're going to pay the money back that they think was taken from the previous, and now food or money to pay for the food now, and they take back gifts. They understand their circumstances being difficult, and they fear the power of Egypt. And so they go back prepared to humble themselves before Joseph. And that's what we see when Joseph sees the brothers. And you got to remember, at this point, it's been 20 years since Joseph has seen his brother Benjamin. And when he comes into the room, of course, they don't recognize him, but he is overwhelmed with emotion to see his brother. He has to remove himself, cleans himself back up, and then probably tests his brother again, for he gives Benjamin 5 times as much food as the other brothers to see if they will treat Benjamin the way that they had treated him in the favoritism that he received from Jacob. And we see this is chapter 44. So Joseph instructs the servants at this point, putting the money back in their bags. And we see at this point that he tells them to put the silver cup in Benjamin's bag. So testing them once again, setting them up in chapter 44, verse 13, and all the brothers going back to Egypt. He does not think, or he thinks that perhaps, or he wants to find out, will they leave Benjamin? Will they treat Benjamin in the manner in which they treated him? And again, as we saw, Judah was the one that offered his life. Will he be true to his word? And Judah fulfills that pledge. He steps up and will not leave Benjamin. Them having gone back, and he offers himself to free the life of Benjamin. And in that point, Joseph, transformation. His attitude to his brothers, everything changes. He reveals himself to his brothers. We see the transformation, the grace of God to transform the heart of Judah. And then in his transformation, confirmation to his brother Joseph that they have changed. And now he changes in his relationship to his brothers at this point. But notice as Joseph speaks, this is chapter 45 at this point, and he asks if his father is still alive. The brothers are not happy at this point. They are terrified. And if we put ourselves into their shoes, we certainly understand Joseph is in a position to seek vengeance and have all of it that he would want. He could do any and everything that he would want to his brothers to bring some type of fleshly satisfaction, and his brothers know that. They are terrified. But notice in chapter 45, verses 4 through 13, Joseph says, "Come here. I am your brother that you sold into Egypt." And then twice he mentions about them and what they had done to him. And so you know that from deep inside of them, there is fear and trepidation rising as they anticipate what Joseph is going to do. But verse 5, quote, "And now do not be distressed or angry with yourselves." Wow. Joseph offers peace. That's not natural. And we have to ask ourselves, like, how can Joseph go against human nature and offer peace to his brothers? Well, the text reveals it to us. It reveals to us the heart of Joseph. As we see, he says, God, not you, God sent me before you to preserve life. Verse 7, And God sent me before you to preserve for you a remnant on earth and to keep alive for you many survivors. So it was not you who sent me here, but God. He has made me a father to Pharaoh and lord of all his house and ruler over all the land of Egypt. Joseph recognized that in the affairs of man that God is working. There's nothing in the text that would indicate that God came down and explained to Joseph or revealed to Joseph what he was doing in all those years. But Joseph had an understanding that God is working in the affairs of man, and Joseph trusted God. Despite the circumstances and the trials and the suffering, Joseph trusted God. And now put into the situation where human nature would say vengeance, Joseph says, peace. Do not be distressed. It was not you. It was God. That is powerful. God would do it again in Exodus, and he does it as we see throughout the scriptures. God's ways are above our ways, and we praise him for that. Now, as we notice, as we come to Genesis chapter 46, Joseph sins for Jacob. But Jacob is resistant because Jacob is in the land of promise. And Jacob trusts the promises of God. I am in the right place. And he doesn't want to leave, but God speaks to Jacob. Verse 3 of 46, I am God. And we know he could stop at that point, but he explains to Jacob that for an appointed time, he will go and they will go, but God will bring them back into this land. He must trust and obey. So verse 29 of chapter 46, we see the reunion. And of course, it's emotional as Jacob is reunited. Wow, think about that. Lost your son for 2 decades. Thought he was dead. Reunited with his son Joseph. And of course, it was emotional. Now, as we come into chapter 47, it records the severity of the famine. And we must notice this. The famine is severe for everybody, but notice how it affects Egypt and the Egyptians versus the rich provision of God for Israel. The Egyptians are running out of resources, and so they go before Pharaoh, which means they go before Joseph, because Joseph being one who would take care of this, and they have nothing in order to provide for themselves. And so through this process, they give up their livestock. And for a period, they're fine. But then again, they come to where they can't provide for themselves, going back before Joseph, and now they have to give their lands. And then eventually they have to give of themselves, and eventually they have to give everything. Pharaoh owns them and their lands. But meanwhile, Israel, as we read in chapter 47, verse 27, Israel settled in the land of Egypt, in the land of Goshen, and they gained possessions in it and were fruitful and multiplied greatly. How is that so? God is in control. We know this. Jesus has told this in Matthew 6. He says, therefore, do not be anxious, saying, what shall we eat? Or what shall we drink? Or what shall we wear? For the Gentiles seek after all these things, and your heavenly Father knows that you need them all. But seek first the kingdom of God and his righteousness, and all these things will be added to you. Therefore, do not be anxious about tomorrow, for tomorrow will be anxious for itself. Sufficient for the day is its own trouble. This is our faith. We trust God. If we will seek first Jesus and his kingdom, these things that we need, he will provide them. And evidence in the text usually shows he provides abundantly. We must not worry. God will provide. Now, as we continue in the text, we see even though they're gaining and so forth, we see Jacob has a different focus. He's not caught up in the rich provisions that are here in Egypt, the wisdom of Jacob. He is still concerned with that land of promise. He is still concerned with the promises of God. Chapter 47, verses 29 through 31, Jacob demands. He demands that his son Joseph make a covenant with him to not bury his body in Egypt, but to take his body back so that he can be buried with Abraham and Sarah and Isaac and Rebekah and Leah in the land of promise. And of course, Joseph abides in this. We must have the same eyes of faith as Jacob. It's easy for us to get caught up in the rich provisions of this life on earth, but this is not our home. Our focus and our hope must be in Jesus and a life with God in heaven, the final rest. We must have the focus of Jacob. It's easy to get distracted and to live in the flesh, but we must live with the eyes of faith of Jacob. Think about what Paul says as he wrote to the Philippians, I am hard pressed between the two. We feel that. We're hard pressed. My desire is to depart and be with Christ, for that is far better. Or as he told the Corinthians, yes, we are of good courage and we would rather be away from the body and at home with the Lord. So we must never forget that we are in Egypt right now. And we are looking to the hope that we have, and keep those eyes of faith. Keep focused. In Genesis chapter 48, verse 5, you've got to remember that Joseph married an Egyptian woman and had boys outside of Israel, raised in Egypt. And Jacob says this, and now your two sons who were born to you in the land of Egypt before I came to you in Egypt are mine. Ephraim and Manasseh shall be mine, as Reuben and Simeon are. Jacob says that your two sons belong to me, not Egypt. They belong to Israel, and they will be treated fairly. They will be treated as the first and second born of Israel, Reuben and Simeon. They are now descendants of mine. That is full adoption. Wow. Jacob has taken the sons of Joseph and made them his and brought them into the covenant. It's beautiful. And as we think about this amazing picture, as it continues, Jacob is now going to lay his hands upon the two sons and bless them. And the right hand should be on the firstborn and the left hand on the secondborn, but Jacob crosses his hands. This does not please Joseph. He tries to uncross them, but Jacob will not have it. You see that in verse 19 of chapter 48. The younger brother is going to be greater than the older. And then Jacob pronounces his blessing, and we see that God is stepping outside the order of the firstborn, but this is nothing new. For as we remember, Isaac received the blessing, not Ishmael. We remember that Jacob received the blessing, not Esau. Judah is going to receive the blessing, not Reuben. Of Judah's children, Perez will receive the blessing, not Zerah. And now Ephraim receives the blessing, not Manasseh. And we remember that it is not order that will decide as far as coming into this covenant of grace with God. The Jews were first. Gentiles. God will take the Gentiles and fully adopt us and give us our rightful place, determined right by him, and have all the spiritual blessings of this covenant of grace. And here in the book of Genesis, the beginning of the story of redemption, he reveals it to us. Wow, man, it's amazing. And as we think about God's grace, this is the power for us to overcome the trials, the sufferings of this life. whatever circumstances that would come before us, God's grace is what allows us and helps us and compels us to press forward and to overcome. Genesis 49 records the blessings that Jacob gives upon the 12 sons. Verse 28 declares that Jacob blessed his sons, quote, blessing each with the blessing suitable to him. And his final command was to be buried, of course, back in the land of promise, back in Canaan. Genesis 50 records Joseph keeping his father's wishes. But now, of course, or I shouldn't say of course, but the brothers, they are again worried after the death of Jacob. They are again afraid. They think now that Jacob is gone, that maybe at this point Joseph will bring about his vengeance upon them. And so in chapter 50, we get to find out, will Joseph once and for all forgive his brothers? Verse 15 records the brothers' fear. It may be that Joseph will hate us and pay us back for all the evil that we did to him. Is Joseph going to forgive his brothers? So after the message comes to Joseph, the brothers come before Joseph and essentially plead for their lives. But Joseph says, behold, we are your servants. Verse 18. Joseph forgives them. Verse 21, so do not fear. I will provide for you and your little ones. Thus he comforts them. He speaks kindly to them. How is it possible? And again, Joseph goes back to God as he says, quote, do not fear, for am I in the place of God? It's not my place to punish you. He recognizes the providence of God and God working through even wickedness. And we even think back to the words of Habakkuk as he cries out to the Lord, why do you use wicked, sinful people? But when God looks around, what else is there to use? Only Jesus was perfect. And we must remember this wisdom in the affairs of man. And so we see they have put their hope in the promises of God. And Joseph is willing to forgive his brothers. As I come to conclusion, I want you to listen to the blessing that is put upon Judah. This is chapter 49, verses 8 through 12. Judah, your brothers shall praise you. Your hand shall be on the neck of your enemies. Your father's son shall bow down before you. Judah is a lion's cub. From the prey, my son, you have gone up. He stooped down. He crouched as a lion and as a lioness. Who dares rouse him? The scepter shall not depart from Judah, nor the ruler's staff from between his feet, until tribute comes to him. And to him shall be the obedience of the peoples, binding his foal to the vine and his donkey's colt to the choice vine. He has washed his garments in wine and his vesture in the blood of grapes. His eyes are darker than wine, and his teeth whiter than milk. The Lion of the tribe of Judah is going to come, and he is going to rule as king. Tribute and the obedience of the people will come to him. In his day, there will be plenty of blessings for everyone as he stands with strength and power. And we know that John, in the book of Revelation, reveals to us that Jesus fulfills this. As he said in chapter 5, verse 5, weep no more. Behold, the Lion of the tribe of Judah, the root of David, has conquered so that he can open the scroll and its 7 seals. Jesus comes, and of course, he deals with our enemies and brings redemption to those of us that have put our faith in him. And that is our greatest gift and our greatest grace, which we overcome the trials and the sufferings and the circumstances of this life. And that is who we walk with. If there be any among us this morning that are not in the Lord's army, that are not in the grace of God that comes through Jesus Christ, what are we waiting for? What excuses do we have? Because when the time passes, you will have nothing but disappointment regret, and torment. There is no sufficient excuse to delay. Do not be caught up in the distractions. The I must do this or I feel that is foolishness. Consider what has been placed before us and this Jesus who went against all of nature and humbled himself in that of a servant and gave his life for each and every one of us. What are you willing to do for him? Let this rest upon our hearts. If you have need to obey the gospel,